Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining our webinar tonight. This is the Pharmaceutical Patents in Canada 2017 Year in Review, hosted by Smart & Biggar Featherstonhaugh. My name is Kevin Sue, and I'm a lawyer in the Life Sciences Practice Group of Smart & Biggar, and I'm going to be your host and moderator for today's webinar. So today, our speakers will be providing a recap, really a quick 30-minute tour of the major developments in Canadian life science and regulatory law of 2017. It seems that the courts and governments have been quite busy this year, and it was an interesting year with lots of major developments in patent linkage, patent term, and substantive patent law developments. Our panelists will speak also to what we might expect for 2018, including many of the practical impacts of the developments that we saw. As our speakers will be covering each topic at a high level today, if anybody in the audience wants more detail on the topics, you can review our RxIP Update 2017 Highlights article, which you can access through the Resources panel on the right side of your screen or on our firm's website under Articles. Today, we're going to hear from two of our firm's experts on the topics that we're going to discuss. We have Nancy Pei. Nancy is a partner in the firm's Life Sciences Practice Group and represents pharmaceutical innovators in litigation matters and is also a leading expert on related regulatory matters. We also have Yoon Kang. Yoon is also a partner at the firm's Life Science Practice Group and also represents pharmaceutical innovators in litigation matters and has a very active practice as well in patent procurement. And Nancy and Yoon are very well placed to discuss some of the issues we have. They were counsel in two of the cases that we'll be discussing today. And as a note for all of our audience members, you can submit questions to the speakers at any time by typing them into the Q&A panel that we have set up, and you should see that on the right side of your screen. We're going to be keeping an eye on the Q&A panel, and we really encourage all of our listeners to be active participants and ask Nancy and Yoon some tough questions.
But not too tough, though. Just tough enough, please.
Thanks, Yoon. On that note, let's go on to our top 10 list. So the top story we covered in 2017, Yoon, this is surely a headline story not only closely watched here in Canada, but internationally as well, has to be the Supreme Court of Canada's Nexium decision and the fallout from that judgment. And I'm sure you're very familiar with this case, but can you please remind the audience what the case is about and what we can expect to flow from that decision?
Thank you, Kevin. As you said, this case was closely watched because it was going to decide, and did decide, once and for all, whether the so-called promise doctrine was a correct test for patent utility in Canada.
And the promise doctrine, as we all know, has been quite controversial in the last decade or so, especially for the pharmaceutical industry.
That's right. It was very controversial because the test for patent utility in the federal courts was no longer whether an invention was useful or had a practical utility at the time of filing. Instead, every utility described in the patent, if construed to be promised, had to be demonstrated or soundly predicted as of the patent filing date. It was a problematic doctrine, particularly for pharmaceutical patents, because the standard for utility was often onerous and elevated to therapeutic utility as of the filing date. And several clearly useful pharmaceutical patents, including the Nexium patent, had been invalidated under the doctrine in the federal courts. The Supreme Court decision was very significant, not just for the Nexium patent, but for pharmaceutical patents generally. First, the decision struck down the promise doctrine as unsound and incorrect in law. And second, the decision clarified that the test for patent utility is scintilla utility and is to be assessed by asking whether the subject matter claimed is useful in the sense that it is capable of a practical purpose. Kevin, you also asked about the fallout from the judgment, and this next slide speaks to that, because the Federal Court of Appeal in that decision involving BMS and Apotex subsequently applied the clarified test for patent utility and found that the compound claimed in that case, dasatinib, inhibition of a biological target implicated in disease was sufficient for utility. Our expectation is that the federal court will apply the utility test in the same way as a court of appeal did in the BMS case. At the same time, though, we should also expect that generic companies, and Apotex in particular, will argue that overpromises can still ground invalidity for reasons other than utility, such as insufficiency, overbreadth, and willful intent to mislead. Thus far, the arguments have sounded a lot like the same promise doctrine that was struck and have not gained much traction. But we'll have to see how these arguments get sorted out ultimately on the merits.
Thanks, Yoon, for that summary. Our second issue, also of great importance and interest, particularly these days since trade agreements have been making the rounds, is for Nancy. And number 2 is the Canada-EU Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, also known as CETA. And these, the trade agreements seem to have a big impact on the pharmaceutical, regulatory, and patent regimes. Nancy, can you please remind us what we need to know about the amendments coming from CETA?
Well, there were 2 main sets of CETA amendments in the pharma area, both of which came into force on September the 21st. The amendments were substantial and were covered in detail in our CETA webinar last fall, and if you missed that, we'll be including an archived link to the replay in our post-event email today. I can only touch very briefly on some of the new elements. The first set was the introduction of Certificates of Supplementary Protection, or CSPs, resulting in Canada's new patent term extension regime. The term of extension is calculated as the regulatory approval, or NOC date, minus the patent filing date, minus 5 years, but capped at 2 years. There are a number of requirements for a CSP, too numerous to review, but I'll highlight just 2. First, because this is the one that likely requires the most internal coordination, is that the new drug submission in Canada must be filed within 12 months of the first related foreign regulatory filing. There is a transitional provision, but very few cases will fall within that. Second, the 120-day deadline for filing the CSP application runs from the NOC date or the patent grant date if the patent issues after the NOC. As having the patent granted before the NOC puts the CSP application in the highest priority group if there is a conflict, coordinating those dates should always be a consideration. There are many more elements to the regime, and again, I'll refer you to details we've provided elsewhere, including in our newsletter. The second set of amendments flowing from CETA were the PMNOC, or linkage regulation amendments. These amendments will apply when a notice of allegation, or NOA, is served on or after September 21. They ended our system of dual litigation. So in Canada, we now have one stream. There's still a 24-month statutory stay, but there are a number of new components, and these include the following. Once challenged in an NOA, commencing an action under the regulations will be the only opportunity to assert the patents regarding that generic or biosimilar submission. It's what we're calling a litigate it or lose it regime. There will now be discovery and trial. Innovators will now have a right of appeal for all decisions on the merits. All patent claims can be asserted, and the Section 8 damages provision has been expanded. Finally, for patents that are not listed on the register, for example, process patents, those now can be asserted in a separate action as soon as a generic serves its NOA. So it's an entirely new litigation regime for us here in Canada. For those who are well familiar with the U.S. scheme, we published a chart comparing this new regime to the Hatch-Waxman regime, and there's a link to that now on your screen. It'll be interesting in 2018 and beyond to see how the first few cases, and there are 4 we've seen so far, play out in the federal court from a procedural perspective. With the combination of the new elements from both the CSP regime and the linkage regulation amendments, your Canadian portfolio should require a fresh look in light of those changes, regardless of where each drug is in its life cycle.
Thanks, Nancy. You also get number 3, also relating to pharmaceuticals, and those are the upcoming changes relating to pricing from the PMPRB regulations. How significant will those be?
Well, if passed in the form proposed, they will be very significant. So stepping back a bit, the PMPRB is the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board. It governs the prices of patented medicines in Canada. The proposal for the amendments came out on December the 2nd, with the proposed coming into force date of January 1, 2019, which is now less than a year away. Comments on the draft language may be submitted until February the 15th. There are a number of elements that are proposed, two of which are, first, expanding the list of comparator countries, increasing the list from 7 countries to 12, but excluding the higher price countries, US and Switzerland. Second, adding as a factor in setting price 3 new factors. 1, the pharmacoeconomic value of the drug, 2, its market size, and 3, the GDP in Canada and GDP per capita in Canada. And these are entirely new pricing factors. The new pricing framework could result in significant changes, not only to anticipated prices of yet to be launched drugs, but for existing drugs as well, as the PMPRB has signaled the possibility of re-benchmarking in light of new indications or a change in market conditions, but only after the start of next year. Draft new guidelines are expected this spring, and those will be very important to see how the PMPRB specifically proposes to apply the new regulations. I also want to mention a few interesting PMPRB decisions that came out last year. There were 2 relating to Alexion Soliris. First, the board found its guidance applied on one issue but not on another, and that decision's been challenged, and the federal court will likely hear that one this year. The Court of Appeal, in a separate decision, rejected Alexion's constitutionality arguments that the PMPRB provisions of the Patent Act were invalid. Another closely watched decision was the Differin decision, a surprising decision of the board which was reversed this year by the federal court and related to the issue of the meaning of pertaining to in the Act, which is critical because this is the required nexus between the patent and the drug at issue that triggers the board's jurisdiction. The federal court found the board erred in ignoring the claim language and finding jurisdiction. That decision is before the Federal Court of Appeal, and that one should be heard in 2018 as well. So another interesting one to look out for in 2018.
Thank you, Nancy. Speaking of courts, turning back to Yoon for number 4, looking at some of the court decisions that came out in 2017, can you tell us a bit about Section 8 of the PM&OC regulations? It seems that there have been quite a few Section 8 decisions that have been working their way through the courts, and we've got a better sense of how they're playing out, especially now in 2017.
Yes, there were a few in 2017. To remind everyone what Section 8 is, it's a provision under the PM&OC regulations that allow for recovery of a generic's losses if its market entry is delayed because the innovator commenced the proceeding and is ultimately not successful. We've listed the 2017 decisions on the slide. The omeprazole decision considers the effect of infringement and should be noted because there haven't been many decisions considering the effect of infringement in the context of a Section 8 action. In this case, in a quantification reference, the judge quantified Apotex's Section 8 losses as nil because had it entered the market, it would have infringed AstraZeneca's patent and would have had to disgorge all of its profits to AstraZeneca. An appeal is pending on that.
Thank you. And Nancy, you've got number 5. We're approaching our halfway point. And this is a topic that I'm sure you're quite familiar with, and that is the non-infringing alternative defense. And this one seems to be still an area that's actively developing. Nancy, can you tell us what that is and what happened on that front in 2017?
So in the quantification of damages and profits from patent infringement, defendants have raised what's called a non-infringing alternative, or NIA defense. In the context of profits, the argument goes something like this. If I can show that I would and could have sold an equally profitable non-infringing alternative had I not infringed, then no profits are owed as you are only entitled to the portion of my profits that are causally attributable to the invention. There are 2 decisions that came out in 2017 that considered this defense in the context of an election of the infringer's profits. In February, the Court of Appeal allowed Apotex's appeal of a decision that had rejected its NIA argument relating to its export sales. Apotex had argued that it would and could have made those export sales instead from another country, bypassing infringement of the Canadian patent. The Federal Court of Appeal found that the defense was viable in law and sent it back to the trial judge to reconsider it on its facts. In July, the trial judge in the omeprazole reference, and that's the same case that Yoon had mentioned, rejected Apotex's NIA defenses. The patent at issue was a formulation patent. Apotex created a number of alleged NIAs, so different formulations, for the purpose of the litigation. The judge found Apotex did not establish that it would or could have sold any of those formulations, and the judge also rejected Apotex's defense based on alleged NIAs from foreign sources. Looking ahead, we can expect defendants to continue to raise such attacks. However, unless they actually had an NIA available in the relevant time period, ready to go, it may in many cases be difficult to make out such defense on the facts.
Thanks, Nancy. We're going to keep a close eye on that one. And back to Yoon for number 6. And number 6 on our list is an update on biosimilars, what we used to refer to as subsequent entry biologics in Canada. What developments took place in 2017 that our listeners should know about?
There were 2 further biosimilar approvals in 2017, bringing the total approvals to 8 in Canada based on 5 reference products. The 2 were Orelzi and Renflexis, both second entrant biosimilars. And to remind everyone, for biosimilars in Canada, unlike in the United States, the litigation scheme and data protection is the same as for small molecules. As for litigation, we're now seeing a number of cases involving biosimilar products, all of which are listed on the slide, and those will likely continue to make their way through the courts in 2018. A closely watched matter last year was which sponsor would be the first challenger under the amended NOC regulations. Amgen was the first for its biosimilar product to Roche's Herceptin, challenging Genentech's patents.
Thank you. And on to number 7. Nancy, this one's for you. There were a few proposed Health Canada regulatory amendments and guidance updates that we saw last year. Can you tell us what were the key updates we should know about?
So we followed in our newsletter this past year actually a large number of such updates, and I'll just refer to a few. On the regulation side, there are consultations ongoing, including relating to a proposed change in the definition of pharmaceutical equivalents that would, for example, permit a generic drug to have a different salt form from the Canadian reference product. This is potentially quite an important issue. Draft regulations haven't been proposed yet. A notice of intent only has been released, but this is something to closely watch going forward. On the Health Canada guidance policy side, a number of new guidances and policy updates issued as well in 2017, only a few of which are listed on this slide. I'll point out only the revised data protection guidance, which provides more detail on Health Canada's application of the pediatric extension to data protection, which is 6 months added to the standard 8-year data protection term. And a reminder that the deadline to seek the benefit of this extension is 5 years after the issuance of the first marketing approval.
Thank you, Nancy. And now we go from government regulations back to the courts. So, Yoon, for number 8, we've been regularly reporting in our RxIP newsletter on all the PMNOC decisions on the merits, both at the Federal Court and the Federal Court of Appeal in 2017. Of those decisions, which ones were of particular note and importance for our listeners?
Of the 6 Federal Court and 3 Court of Appeal PMNOC decisions in 2017, I would say the most notable were the Court of Appeal Reataz and Sprycel decisions. I'll talk a bit about the Reataz decision on obviousness under the next topic, and I also mentioned the Sprycel decision earlier, which was the Court of Appeal decision to consider the Supreme Court Nexium decision on utility. In terms of broader stats, based on the year ending March 31, there were 32 PMNOC applications started, continuing a general downward trend. and 31 human drugs were granted data protection. So quite a number of innovative drugs were approved by Health Canada in 2017.
So Yoon, for number 9, so you had mentioned the Rayataz decision, and it seems to relate to an area of substantive law that looks like it's coming back into prominence. Can you tell us about what happened in that decision and specifically the concept of inventive concept according to the Court of Appeal in 2017?
Yes. Identification of inventive concept is a part of the framework for assessing obviousness as set up by the Supreme Court in its 2008 Plavix decision. Is the benchmark against which priority is assessed. The Federal Court of Appeal considered the meaning of inventive concept in 2 decisions in 2017. In the April Rayataz decision, the court held that the inventive concept is not materially different from the solution taught by the patent. On the facts of that case, the patent simply claimed the bisulfate salt of atazanavir. The court held that the inventive concept was the salt, which is pharmaceutically acceptable because it has equal or better bioavailability than the free base. In the subsequent November CBAT decision, the court appeared to be frustrated as to the meaning of the inventive concept, concluding that inventive concept can be avoided altogether by instead simply construing the claim. It'll be interesting to see how the courts address this further in 2018 and whether the meaning of inventive concept in the obviousness analysis may be clarified.
Indeed, thanks. We're going to keep an eye on that one as well. And number 10, last but not least, certainly, back to Nancy, you get our final entry. Can you provide us with an update on litigation involving Health Canada?
So there's not a lot to say on this topic. Apotex has historically challenged a number of Health Canada decisions, and some of those challenges have resulted in decisions in 2017, which are listed on this slide. In addition to appeals that are pending, 2 damages actions are making their way through the courts relating to Apotex's trazodone as well as an import ban.
Thank you, Nancy and Yoon, for those very insightful updates on our top 10 list. It's a lot of information for 1 year, and I know we had a whirlwind tour there. Hopefully that reminds our listeners of what the new developments are and what they might want to know about in the coming year. And it looks like 2018 will shape up to be quite interesting given all these developments. I'm just looking at the time. It looks like we have maybe 5 or 6 minutes for a few questions. I, of course, encourage our audience members to type questions into the Q&A box, and we can address them to our panel of experts here, and we're happy to address any of those as well. So let me just take a look at our list. So a question for our panelists. Given the new PMNOC regime and the changes to pharmaceutical patent litigation that came with the changes, what do you think the impact will be on litigation going forward? And particularly, are we seeing more or less litigation under the new regulations?
I think it's still early days. There were only 4 actions by the end of 2017, but that represents only a 2-month period after the earliest NOAs under the new regime could have been served. The actions will definitely be more onerous on both parties, given the discovery requirement and trial. This may therefore dissuade some generics and biosimilar sponsors from challenging certain patents that might have otherwise been challenged under the old regime, but we'll have to see.
Thanks, Yoon. And another question. Under the revised patent regime for CETA, one interesting item is the patent term extension, or the CSPs that Nancy talked about, for drugs held up in regulatory review. Do we have an update on whether companies have started to take advantage of these provisions and how the government has been handling them so far?
Yes, so Health Canada maintains a public register of CSP applications on its website, so anyone can check. I checked the register just yesterday, and there were 4 applications on file, and that was the number as it stood at the end of last year. So there are some, and certainly there will be more to come.
Thanks for that update, Nancy. And sorry, I'm just reading my list here, and we got another question. One for the litigators. An update, what does our panelists think is the current state of expert hot tubbing, particularly in PMNOC litigation? Is it still an active concept that's being pursued by the courts, or has that been abandoned?
So the concept of hot tubbing is having experts up on the stand at the same time so they can be asked the same question, and the goal being to try to reach common ground. As far as I know, hot tubbing, at least in the pharma context, has only been used in one case so far, and that was a case a number of years ago. I think it was back in 2006. Under the PMNOC litigation, of course, we wouldn't see hot tubbing because you had out-of-court testimony. It is still possible it could happen under the new PMNOC actions at trial, but again, there's been very little interest on doing that ever since that first hot tubbing experience many years ago.
I would tend to agree that given the trend thus far, it is merely a concept that seems to have not really taken off in Canada.
Thanks, Yoon. And another question from the audience, perhaps of more general nature, given the development so far. What advice would our panelists give to innovators, and this is in the pharmaceutical life sciences industry, that would be of strategic importance to look out for in 2018?
So this is Nancy. I would say there were so many changes in 2017, and I touched on this when I was talking about the CETA amendments. It really requires a fresh look at your portfolio and what's going on. So there's a lot of new moving parts now, both with CSPs as well as the changes to the PMNOC regulations, and now we've got this new PMPRB piece coming, as well as changes on the regulatory side. So for example, that identical medicinal ingredient issue relating to, among other things, different salt forms. So there's a lot to digest and as I said, look at the portfolio with fresh eyes because a lot of elements like, for example, process patents that were really not part of your primary strategy previously probably should be now. So that's what I would say. Have a fresh look with all these changes that have happened.
I would only add this. I think for the innovators, it's always been important to make sure to coordinate patent rights within the regulatory context in Canada, and then that's going to be particularly important moving forward with the introduction of CSP and potential changes to the PMPRB. And so I would definitely focus on sort of that coordination.
Great. Thank you, Nancy and Yoon, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen of the audience who had some very good questions and participated actively. That was the time we had for the last question, so don't hesitate to reach out to any of our speakers if you'd like to discuss anything that you heard today. I know there are a lot of issues that have come up, and Nancy and Yoon would be happy to take your call, answer your emails for any further questions, and we thank you very much for joining us today on our webinar. For more updates, continue to subscribe and read our RXIP newsletter.